And welcome back to Coaching Through the Bible. This week, Jethro on giving advice. Before we dive deep into Jethro, two other comments first. One, with respect to an update to my No Complaining Challenge, and two, sort of a shout out with respect to Jethro himself. An update on the No Complaining Challenge. Is it okay to complain about yourself if you're trying to do a No Complaining Challenge? Well, so I tried for the last week to not complain, or at least to complain a lot less and to notice when I was complaining. So I must admit that I did not succeed in not complaining for the entire week. That's a very hard ask. But I was certainly more aware of when I was complaining and what kind of complaining I in fact was doing. So if nothing else, I think that's a victory for the No Complaining Challenge, to at least be more aware and to be mindful and clued in to what it is that you're doing and saying and how it is that you're doing it and saying it. And so whether it was venting or simply just trying to be constructive, or what I called last week instructional complaining, for solutions, I was certainly more aware of it. I certainly complained less because I was paying attention to it. I was certainly more appreciative of all good things. So that's my update on that. It's still a work in progress, still something I need to continue to work on week over week. I want to thank those who jumped in and joined me for the No Complaining Challenge, and sort of give me an update. If you can, shoot me a text or WhatsApp or a post somewhere where you're listening to this about how you succeeded with your No Complaining Challenge. Hopefully you did better than I did. On the other side of that, just a quick shout out. Part of what we're going to discuss this week on Jethro is the nature of the relationship between an in-law, a father-in-law and a son-in-law, a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, whatever that is. So just a shout out to everyone who is trying to do a great job in those relationships. Hopefully you're blessed to have good in-law relationships. And that is a blessing among many blessings in life. That is a great blessing to have. Everyone's trying to do their best always. And so shout out to all those who are trying to do a great job in those relationships and just be there and be that good person for everyone else in their family. So here we go, Jethro on giving advice. So how do we give advice? Like, what's the method? Is there a way? And also, on the other side of that, how about taking advice? What about there? And so in this week's reading, in the beginning of the story, before the highlight, which is really the giving of the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, there is this whole story about Jethro's arrival in the camp and his interaction with Moses, and their one giving advice session where Jethro gives an incredible insight and set of parameters to Moses about how to build a better judicial system. And so it got me thinking a lot, and I think a lot about this section of the Bible, because I think that this section of the Bible is very much goes to the core of what I do professionally in terms of coaching and consulting people and organizations. And I think there's probably a master class in studying the first couple of sections here of the reading with respect to how it is that Jethro gives the advice and how it is that Moses goes about accepting that advice and implementing it. And so what I want to sort of do with you today is slightly different and not go too heavy into the reading, into the text, to point out a couple of things that are noticeable and interesting, and then to talk about a Harvard Business Review article on giving and receiving advice. And so what I want to sort of share with you is something to pay attention to when you're reading through the Bible this week in this section. Notice a couple of very keen things. The first is that when a person is sort of in a position to potentially give advice, sometimes it's the case that a person can sort of out of nowhere give the right advice or the best advice, but it doesn't mean that the person on the other end of it, the receiver, the recipient, is always just simply going to accept it as is. And so I want you to notice something really interesting that the Bible does, is that in setting up this whole event, the descriptors, the descriptions and the terms that it uses to describe Jethro here, and the way that it describes Moses in relation to Jethro, are intentional. Obviously, everything in the Bible is intentional and purposeful, and every word is there on purpose, no extraneous words. But notice the way that Jethro is described at the beginning of the section. He is, generally speaking, always described in the context or in relation to Moses. It's always that he is, the father of the wife of Tzipporah, that he is the father-in-law of Moses in the second verse. Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, takes Tzipporah, the wife of Moses, to the camp with the children. It's an interesting way of describing him in that space. But it also goes further, right? Again, in verse 5, you get it again, a similar kind of idea. In verse 7, Moses is described as going out to see his father-in-law, right? They are back and forth. The Bible is very purposeful in using those terms over and over and over again to set up an understanding of the nature of the relationship, because it's super important to appreciate that when we are in positions to give advice or to receive advice, that the person on both ends of that is a person also. And so the nature of the relationship there with that person requires, in most cases, some level of minimally trust, respect, honor, and even if you can go a little bit further, in the case of Moses and Jethro, there is a familial relationship there, which is vital for what is about to happen in the second section, starting in verse 13, where he goes into the whole discussion about the judicial system. And so notice that the way it's described. Also notice that the first time Jethro is mentioned in the Bible, at the beginning of the book of Exodus, and how he's described in terms of his role as a person of God, a person of high regard and high renown, a person who is viewed as a person of character. It puts him in a certain place and a certain standing so that when it is that he says something, it's meaningful and it's valuable and it's taken to heart. He is viewed in that space. It's different than if it's simply just someone who is a friend of Moses, right? Or someone who's a friend of ours who's giving us advice, who doesn't have that place of honor and respect, but they want to be kind and they want to help us out. And they give us advice and, they sort of, share some insight with us. It's a different sort of approach that we have and reaction that we have to that advice and to the giving of that advice. The friend relationship is different than the professional coaching consultant relationship. And so it's important to sort of appreciate that first. That's the first thing. The second thing to really sort of zone in on here is in verse 13 and 14, notice what Jethro does. Jethro pays attention. He's watching. We mentioned this differently by Joseph when Joseph is listening to Pharaoh in the dreams, and he's listening to the two servants in their dreams, that the method by which Joseph observes to then offer his explanations and his interpretations and his advice is through listening, the skill of listening. And we talked about it then. It's super important, incredibly valuable to really be able to listen first before offering any sort of insight or advice. The person has to not just be ready to answer and to sort of, leap in that space, but rather to first, pay attention, to listen, to hear what's going on before dispensing of advice. Differently, but in the same sort of overall space, Jethro is watching. Verse 14 begins, it's the following day, however we understand what day that is exactly. And Jethro sort of goes to work with Moses, right? He goes to see Moses in action. It's a day at the office to sort of see what's happening. And he simply pays attention to what he's doing with the nation or to the nation, specifically in the space of how he judges people and their situations. And so first, he's paying attention. So he's observing everything, every movement, Again, he's been an important advisor. He's been a priest. He's been a person in the highest, spaces in countries, right? Exegetically, it's described that he was even an advisor to Pharaoh at some point. So he has seen courtyards and he has seen people being judged in these spaces, and he certainly has an opinion. But first, he notices what it is that Moses does and what it is that Moses doesn't do, and how Moses is handling this and how he's not handling this, and how the people are reacting and how the people are not reacting. But before he jumps in to offer his explanation, he asks a question. And so the question method about asking the consultee, right, or I'm not sure what term to use there, the person who is being given the advice to the recipient, he asks a question. What is it that you are doing with the nation? And then the second question, follow up, why is it that you sit and everyone stands before you from morning till night? That's in verse 14. He opens it with a question. One of the commentaries actually makes the point that he knows exactly what he wants to say, but he begins the conversation in a way similar to the way that God does at the beginning of the book of Genesis, when he enters into the conversation with Adam and Eve, and when he enters into the conversation with Cain, where God begins with an opening question, a beginning to that conversation, because ultimately they know that it's going to be a difficult conversation. And so here, Jethro does exactly the same thing. So he's operating in a God mode in that way, but he's also really curious. His curiosity is super important. Really wants to understand why Moses is operating this way, where this comes from, perhaps. What's the root of this approach? It's a really powerful, fundamental question, really at its core, going right to the root of whether or not this is right or wrong. And really, it's a question that nobody else can ask Moses. They're all operating from within it. They come into it this way. It only requires an outsider with an observant eye who's coming in and looking at this and thinking there might be something wrong here. There might be a problem here. But I can't simply just offer that advice and that explanation. I really need to explore this further, to peel back layers, to be open to what Moses might reply before jumping in and offering some sort of an explanation. So in the next couple of verses, Moses responds, and then in verse 17, again described as the father-in-law of Moses, right? In verse 17, because therein again, the Bible wants to emphasize the nature of the relationship, that what he's doing and what he's about to say is coming from a place of respect and dignity and, in fact, love. And when it's brought that way, it's more readily acceptable from the perspective of the recipient. Because what Jethro is about to do is he's about to question the person who took this group of people out of Egypt, across the sea, to the space where they're now going to meet God and get the Bible and the Ten Commandments. That is a hefty ask of a consultant. So it has to come from a certain kind of place. And if Moses is going to accept it and to implement it, perhaps he has to feel that too. Maybe Moses doesn't have to, and he can accept something for being true and right. But Jethro goes right after, and he tells him straight out, this is not good. What you are doing is not good. You're going to collapse. The nation's going to collapse. This is not good. And then in verse 19, he simply goes into his plan, which is, hey, listen, perhaps you want to hear something as an approach that's going to work. Now, obviously, Jethro has thought this through. He has seen this, maybe he's seen a model like this before, who knows? But he comes to it in that way. And then he goes through it, and then Moses ultimately implements it and changes judicial structures forever. And so it's super important to sort of keep that in mind. And so what we have then is a really beautiful approach to how to dispense of keen insight and advice in a way that is accepted and received in the way that it was meant to be received and accepted by Moses. And so it's important for us to think about this when it is that we have this urge and this need to dispense advice or to consult or to coach. It may well be that the person who's on the receiving end of that has zero interest. And it may well be that they didn't ask for our opinion. And so there are moments when our opinions are not warranted and should not be shared, and there are moments when they should be. And it's sometimes upon us to scratch the surface first before we begin to dive in to our opinions and our thoughts and our approaches on this. And so this brings me to the Harvard Business Review article on giving and receiving advice. And just to dive into a little bit of the article, so there's a really terrific article, The Art of Giving and Receiving Advice. So really, first of all, from the standpoint of someone who's seeking advice, the article describes sort of four different types of counsel that a person might be seeking. Is it discreet advice, which is, which of my managers should I promote, that kind of a thing. It's a specific thing. Some more general counsel, some sort of a guidance on how to approach a complex or difficult situation. Even if it's coaching and counsel and coaching and consulting are not the same. We described that once before also, that we coach the person and we consult on the problem. But coaching here maybe is, self-awareness or getting people mindful and focused and self-management. Or maybe it's some sort of a mentoring, right? There are different kinds of advice that a person can seek. And at the same time, it's important that the person who might be seeking advice appreciate a couple of things. We talked about this early on in terms of leadership. There's a level of humility that has to be in leadership. The idea that, you're going to lead, yes, but you don't necessarily know all the answers, and you don't necessarily have everything at your fingertips. But that when you go and you seek advice, you're not looking just for confirmation of what you already think. You're looking for someone who's going to provide you with the right insight, someone who's going to maybe provide you with a set of answers that you don't have. And so it's important that you really think about, defining the problem clearly, choosing the right person to be your advisor. Those are really important. Getting a real clear sense of understanding with that person, and not simply just, immediately discounting advice from other people as well. So the article really goes deep into some of these keen insights about receiving advice. And then certainly on the flip side, in terms of giving advice, it's the same sort of set of principles that you really have to think about. You really don't want to overstep your boundaries. You really want to focus in on and zoom in on what the issue specifically is and what it is that the person is actually asking of you. And you can't really go, too far. You want to be a sounding board, as the article describes, and you want to, be able to sort of, if at maybe minimally, simply provide some sort of a frame of reference and sort of an understanding and a framing of the problem, even if you can't necessarily give advice. And so what's going in here, or a solution even. So what's happening in this article is very much what we see in the nature of the relationship between Moses and Jethro. In this sort of, again, it's an in-law relationship, so it's interesting and it's complicated that way. It's also interesting and complicated because of the fact that Moses is the one who talks directly to God. And so to sort of be in a space where you're Jethro and you're giving, you're playing the role of advisor / consultant / coach / mentor / sounding board, all these different things. It's interesting to be in there and to sort of look at it and work it through. As I said earlier, there's a masterclass on giving and receiving advice in these sections. Take a moment to really look at it and deep dive in there and discuss it with other people around you. Sort of be curious about what Moses is thinking and what Jethro is thinking and how they go about it and how it plays out. And then take that home, which is the role that you play potentially as an advisor or as counsel to, friends, family. Family would be parents, in-laws, siblings, children, all those different relationships. And think about, and even in work, the workplace, of course, how you play the role of coach and consultant and advisor and mentor in the place of work as well. And really go to town on yourself in paying attention to how it is that you approach the art of giving advice, and on some levels, the art of receiving that advice as well. So look at yourself as both the Jethro and look at yourself as also the Moses. Have a great week. Look forward to seeing you next week in Coaching Through the Bible. We're going to go deep on some new stuff starting next week. Looking forward to it. Take care.